Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nadia Seeteram. She is a fellow Panther as she did her Ph.D. of Earth System Science here, and she has some postdoctoral research experience back in Columbia University. She's currently leading New York's first proactive voluntary relocation program as the Director of Buyouts, and she has extensive experience in research and policy addressing sea level rise and climate resilience. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I live in New York now, and it's been really cold, so I really appreciate it, Dr. Bond. And yeah, thank you for the lovely introduction. I am now working in a policymaking position for New York State and their housing agency, but I've only interested in that role for about 2.5 months. So the focus of my presentation is actually going to be what I did as a postdoc while I was at the climate school at Columbia. And I really, today want to kind of weave together, what I'm really feeling like, what I'm feeling really passionate about in this sort of adaptation space, which is really connecting climate risk, housing, and migration together. Because believe it or not, it kind of isn't, it isn't really something that I think is always connected together. There's lots of research in this space, but it's not really concentrated always on housing. And even, as part of even in my new role in the Office of Resilient Homes and Communities, we have a mission and we're developing programs and we're implementing programs across the state, but sometimes that climate connection is also lost in terms of where climate sits in the broader intersection of climate and housing. So that's really going to be my goal for today. And I thought I'd just sort of start by just kind of backtracking just a little bit, talking about some of the work I did here at FIU and how I even, how this sort of intersection and interest sort of arose. So my dissertation, the first chapter of it was published very recently. And what I focused on was more or less, this issue of climate migration. That migration isn't going to sort of just happen in one sort of direction. It might have multiple modes and people might move in multiple ways, and that might be different. As time progresses, it'll depend on their own adaptive capacities and what does that mean for migration and what is it going to look like in the future. And so we developed this sort of framework. I'm not going to get into it right now, but the point of it to say is that as I was thinking about migration, as I was thinking about flood risk, as I was thinking about sea level rise, I was ultimately thinking about housing in some respect, but it never really clicked up until we, tried to figure out that framework that we put forth. Again, it's thinking about various modes of migration, various ways that people might be moving. Some people might move, some people may not move at all. Some people may move of their own volition, others might be forced out into it. We wanted to figure out whether or not this framework that we put forward is it reflective of lived experience in any way? So we conducted a bunch of surveys and we did a bunch of interviews trying to figure out how does the lived experience, does it validate this sort of framework or not? And even after all of this work, it wasn't until I came to this very last question that we asked folks in our survey: if you did have to move out of Miami for any kind of climate related reason, where would you go? And this map is just so, it's just, it tracks with what we know about migration, how we know people move. They don't tend to move very far, but it's just so surprising because still, for the most part, people said they would move to Broward County. They would move to Palm Beach. They might move to Tampa, Orlando, and then most people said North Florida. All of these other little lines here, these blue lines, might be one person who said they moved to Colorado, maybe one person who said they moved to Michigan. But for the most part, people wanted to stay in Florida. They didn't want to go very far at all. And that made me kind of nervous in some ways but not really, because climate risks are they're everywhere. And so at the time when I started to think about this project and what my work in migration and thinking about coastal risks meant for housing, I believe this picture on the right was taken after an unnamed rainstorm that closed the airports in Fort Lauderdale. And then this other picture is from Hurricane Ian. Again, it just made me realize that, okay, we tend to, or I tended to focus on Miami a lot, but there are risks all over the state. There are risks all over this country, right? Wildfire, sea level rise, and at the same time, housing is undersupplied across this country. This estimate from Freddie Mac is about 3.8 million units. That probably is just market rate housing, depending if you think about affordable housing, it could be up to 10 million units. So we're just short of housing all across the nation, and these risks are just continuing to surface. And we now know, this was taken for about 3 weeks ago, this is Zillow's sort of housing trend forecast for the next year, that home buyers are increasingly valuing climate in their decisions. And that's, it was one of 6 different trends, and climate resiliency actually made this list, that sellers are highlighting features that offer some degree of protection. Which I think is just, their research found that about 86% of recent home buyers say it's very important to have at least one climate resilient feature. That's an overwhelming amount of people that want that sort of feature, but it makes sense, right? Because along with resilience means in the long term, hopefully it'll be more affordable to have that home. At the same time, movement into these high climate risk areas still continues. There's some new research that says that development is slated for the same floodplains in North Carolina where buyouts are occurring. I will just sort of say that this is something that I think about quite a lot now as we're kind of thinking about new policy for this buyout program. It's not as black and white. At first, when I saw this, I was just like, why were they doing that? But are we as the state really going to deny a buyout for someone, even if development is occurring, somewhere, a few miles down the road? That's a question that we really have to think about. And then also people are still moving into the most flood prone counties and the wildlife urban interface. There is just like a scarcity of land. It is very tough to build. And so where it is a little easier to build sometimes, where it makes the most affordable, the most financial sense to build are these areas. So putting all of this together, the big questions on migration, how are people going to move? We are undersupplied of housing. We have these risks that keep sort of surfacing. My big question is, what is actually being done to build a more climate resilient housing stock across the nation? And so that is really the focus of this entire talk. And believe it or not, there are multiple ways that this can be, multiple levers that we can apply to build resilience, to build risk reduction into housing. That also makes it really tricky. The first set of actions the first levers that we can sort of push are actions that would actually improve the quality of housing construction, housing construction, the actual structure, the actual unit itself. That includes things that we're all very familiar with: elevation, resilient building codes, increasing freeboard.
What's freeboard?
Freeboard is the sort of it sets the base flood elevation for where you're allowed to sort of build. So for folks that in high risk areas, they're usually doing about 2 feet above base flood elevation. Some people can go higher depending on what floodplain. The second set of actions regulate land use and prevent development in high-risk areas. This can include rezoning efforts, manage retreat, buyout programs, things like that. It's very much an underutilized tool for the moment. The third set of actions actually incorporate some of the financial instruments that we can use to sort of push or influence where people buy. And this sort of essentially is an idea, I would say at this point. It's not really in practice, but incorporating climate risk into, for example, mortgages. So the idea is, if you're living in a more risky area and there's some likelihood that your health will face substantial damage in the next 30 years, perhaps you might actually charge a higher interest rate as a result of that. But that gets very tricky for reasons we'll talk about as well. And the fourth set can be kind of broadly grouped into actions that facilitate resilience through infrastructure. So thinking about the surrounding area, not just sort of the unit itself, that includes stormwater management upgrades, seawalls, things of that nature. Now, you probably guessed with all these different actions, there are many different actors. There are many different actors, many different people involved in making any of this sort of happen. So the first set includes government, but that includes federal, state, local government officials, all doing different things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they can be working on climate resilience itself. They can be working more or less in sort of disaster recovery. They can be working in housing. They can be working in economic development, and probably a bunch of other agencies that I haven't actually mentioned. But government plays a huge role at all different levels in producing housing. Then there are the folks in sort of this area that I call housing finance, but I basically kind of grouped insurers and mortgage companies and everyone sort of associated into one kind of category just to make this make things a little bit more manageable. But again, risk and resilience folks at insurance companies, reinsurance companies, the state insurance officials, some of the public sector housing finance people, and then of course the mortgage companies themselves. Our third category includes the home builders, the people who actually construct these units. That actually means the contractors themselves, the actual construction companies, but then the developers who actually make this sort of happen, who get the permits, who finance this development. And then there is, of course, a very big distinction between affordable housing units and market rate units as well. So this, picture just keeps getting more complicated. Then there are the folks that I call design, sort of. It's a broad in the design category. Broadly speaking, folks in sort of urban planning, engineering, architecture firms, the people who are actually responding to building codes or whatever kinds of standards need to be imposed and actually to build the unit. Then there are folks in academia, people, university researchers, those in think tanks who are thinking about policy, thinking how to improve them, thinking about reforms and really trying to inform these decisions. There are folks in advocacy. This is a really broad bucket. It's probably not the best name for this, but these are folks that are working broadly in the nonprofit sector. But they can be doing a lot of different things. At the national level, they can be lobbying. At the local level, they can be lobbying for housing reform. There are also people who are really doing quite a lot of industry-specific stuff that includes developing the codes and standards that we use today, actually developing model code and actually testing it as well. Those are all people kind of in that nonprofit space, believe it or not. And then finally, this is a seventh category that we had to add, but it's not necessarily something that I initially thought of, but the folks who are providing climate risk information are actually playing quite a large role here as well. Not only in the information that they develop, the models that they develop that inform any kind of information, but some of them are actually kind of working a bit in some of the design space as well as they're trying, as we're essentially trying to develop policy and develop new standards as we go along. So lots of different people, lots of different actions, and as a result, the research and the policy, I sort of feel at this sort of what I call the climate adaptation housing kind of policy nexus, it's not quite there yet. A lot of this research and a lot of this work has been focused on decarbonization and energy efficiency and things of that nature, but not necessarily in the impact space. A lot of the research that's occurring, I would say specifically in the adaptation world that I'm mostly in, focuses a lot on household preferences for adaptation, evaluating disaster recovery programs, improving exposure and vulnerability assessment. I've been involved in all three of those, and also sort of thinking about manage retreat. But again, because there are different sectors, a lot of this work is happening in silos. So the insurance folks are thinking about insurance in their field. The real estate economics people are thinking about it in their fields, but there isn't this sort of like collective understanding of, well, to build climate resilient housing, we might actually all need to work together. That isn't quite there yet. And then in terms of policy, again, there are lots of effort. in the decarbonization space. The IRA is something that's, funded a lot of those initiatives. In the IRA, there's been some money for some resilient retrofitting through HUD's Green and Resilient Retrofits program. And then FEMA does a lot of stuff, again, from the disaster recovery perspective, but they do have a few proactive programs as well, like the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities and I think their HGP program as well. But again, housing is not necessarily the focus of those programs. It's just something that it's all kind of a part of. So that is more or less what I wanted to kind of understand. In terms of the research questions, what actually are the risk reduction strategies that are being implemented or proposed to actually build resilience across the housing market in the US broadly? The focus of this talk is actually going to be the private housing markets because we had to narrow down in some ways, but more or less how are we actually, what's being done to develop a more resilient housing stock? And I would say this also focuses on new construction. This is very separate from retrofitting. When we were thinking about these questions, there just aren't a lot of people working in that space right now. But that is a sector that does really need to grow. And then the second part of these questions are, if there are strategies that are out there, if there are policies that are out there, what barriers needed to be overcome to implement them and what enabled those solutions to be implemented? And then what tensions actually exist amongst all these people that sort of impede or, either facilitate one of these strategies from going, to coming, to actually, going into implementation. So for our methods, really went back to the basics here because we didn't really know what, we had these questions, but we knew that there were other questions that are probably as equally important. So we did semi-structured interviews with experts across all of those different sectors that I mentioned. I realize I said 6 key sectors here, but it's actually 7. We had to add the climate services folks in as we were sort of progressing along. But yeah, we tried to get all these folks together in interviews with all these different people from housing policy, the actual development, and construction. Our interviews again focused on new construction. They focused on market rate housing. And within coastal communities, we had to start to put some parameters when this could, really, get out of hand. We did really targeted recruitment for this. This was actually quite difficult because this field is very up and coming. And sometimes people who are working in this field, they may not say, I'm working in climate adaptation and housing. They might say climate resilience, it might be disaster recovery. We used all of these kinds of search terms to find people. We looked at conferences, attendance lists at conferences to find people. We looked at reports to find folks. We did LinkedIn searches, we backtraced. We looked at home builder conference attendee list to get one home builder into our sample. We did get like three home builders, but we had no one participating from the mortgage industry. They just did not respond to us. We started to pilot our questions in August of last year, and our interviews concluded earlier this year in February. We applied directed content analysis to sort of produce those deductive and inductive codes. We had about 3 iterations of coding across 3 different coders because there was just so much information that was generated from these interviews. And we had to double code at least 20% of our sample to ensure consistency across all of our codes. Okay, so now let's get into some results. So very broadly, okay, you can see that. So across our different sectors of employment, so again, we conducted 64 semi-structured interviews. The mean interview time was around 45 minutes. The majority of our participants came from government, around 23%, followed by, again, that broad group of advocacy, which includes a lot of different people, around 18%, and then design, folks in the design industry. We did have a few finance folks and regulators, only about 8 people in home construction and real estate. We had some developers, a few home builders as well. So we had about 9 different people. And then in the information services, which we had to add a little bit later, we got about 2 people in there. Most participants were mid-career, but they were actually very recently in their current position. For the most part, about 2/3 of people had only were in their position for the past, either 1 to 5 years. Most people were working on multifamily market rate housing or single family market rate housing. And most were working primarily on adaptation, though a few folks were working on both in terms of mitigation versus adaptation. Again, we focus primarily in coastal counties because we're really interested in flood resilience. So a lot of our participants came from California, New York, and Florida. Again, that was by design. And for the most part, I would say there, other than folks who are really working at hyper local levels, people were working in multiple areas. So that's why you see a bit of distribution across SNAP. And then every so often, someone was working on wildfire and flood risks as well. So those were always very interesting too. But for the most part, I think we were very successful in capturing a lot of different flood risks. Most people were working on coastal storms. Rainfall came up quite a lot, as well as okay. The first question we asked, really just to kind of ground our participants and kind of get a sense of what they think and where they are. What do you think is the most pressing housing challenge at the moment? Affordability. Almost half of all of our participants said that affordability was their biggest concern. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be sort of just announcing really big codes and I've tried to find one quote that I think really captures what people meant by that sentiment. And so that's sort of how the codes and themes will work. So this is a participant who worked at a think tank, and she said, affordability and availability, which I lumped together. Housing is expensive in a bunch of places because there isn't enough of it, and there are too many households competing for too few. Not particularly groundbreaking. I think we all know that. And then resilience was the second highest mentioned challenge. But again, most of these people worked in the resilience space. And by that, people were mostly just trying to figure out, how do we build responsibility? How do we build new housing, but also make sure that it's going to be resilient to those future risks? And then third was insurance. About 28% of people mentioned insurance. Insurance is a big one that comes to mind with climate change and the risk landscape and how that could possibly be insured and how insurance companies adjust to those changes in risk and what that means for people. And if you've noticed, all 3 of these things, it's really actually hard to separate them. They're all interlinked. People are worried about affordability and insurance. They're worried about resilience and insurance. They're worried about all 3 things. So this is very much the world that these folks are operating in. Okay, let's get to our first question. So what are the actual risk reduction actions, policies, strategies that people discussed and are implementing? We use those words interchangeably throughout this interview series because we weren't always just interviewing folks in government. We were interviewing people at private firms, folks in nonprofit organizations as well. There are a lot of things that came up. I would say broadly, we started to group things into these 7 categories. The first one at the top, I don't think you can see it, but that actually says advocacy. We recorded about 114 actions being taken across the 64 interviews. So about 30 to 33% of those actions are in that sort of advocacy category. And that is pretty much what you kind of think it is. It is educating the public. It is conducting research. It is convening stakeholders, collaborating, advocating, lobbying, providing technical assistance. All of those things are in the resilience space. That is where most of the action is sort of concentrated right now. The second highest, group of strategies that were mentioned were, again, things that really affect the structural resilience of a unit. It's kind of, we're playing around with this language, but for the most part, these are the elevations that are occurring, the increasing freeboard, the using fill to elevate, these types of things that actually impact the resilience of the structure itself. For the most part, these are occurring on a case-by-case basis. They're occurring very small scale. They're very, individual type actions. And then our sort of a third bucket of actions falls into that broader land use category. We've lumped a lot of things in here, including just sort of planning for land use changes, but it should be and infrastructure changes as well, developing new design standards, some actual development away from high-risk areas. But again, lots of work really concentrated in the advocacy space, as well as, sort of structural property level risk reduction, not so much in sort of these sort of areas that have bigger impact, reforms, financial solutions, and policies. So let's talk about some of the barriers that people mention to their work. So for the most part, about almost half of our participants mentioned some kind of issue, some path dependence type of issue, meaning we're kind of going on this route and it's kind of hard to change course now, and things, inertia, something has to change to kind of, move momentum in a different direction. So one of the sub-themes that emerged under, path dependence was this idea of implementing. If we have a new idea that if we want to change something, if we want to do some kind of risk reduction action, well, okay, we have the idea, then how do we actually do it? And so this is from someone, again, in the broadly speaking, in the housing finance world. It's very challenging because I work for a regulator, so I can't cherry pick certain companies and say, we're going to work with so-and-so on this project. I kind of have to put the idea out there and then hope that there's someone who comes and takes it up, that they can match make with a local jurisdiction or an insurer. But basically her point is, so once the concept exists, how do I actually effectuate it? So it's nice to have the idea, but who's going to take it on? Another big barrier here, and I think this will be of interest to some of you in this room, was data quality, information issues. That came up about 45% of the time. This is from a local government participant. I think what we've identified is the biggest issue is that there aren't good compound flood data sets that are available for local governments. And so we're really at the point where we can't make decisions. So again, data quality here was a big issue. Along, in this bucket of data quality includes, just the scientific uncertainty associated with the data that does exist. And some of the information asymmetries that exist as well, where certain people have access to certain data and others don't. These are all sort of themes that emerge under this broader bucket of data information. And then, of course, on the barrier side, financial issues. That, of course, comes up quite a bit. Again, another top answer. This is one sub-theme that I pulled out that was devoted to not just, of course, funding, and capital will always be an issue for every program. But this one was very specific to the developers and the real estate construction folks who were in the sample. And they just highlighted the costs, to builders and to developers. And the point of this quite long quote is more or less that there are a lot of competing interests in the development world. So this person says, there's economic pressure on development too, because there's not only builders' risks of construction costs, but the operating cost means I have less net operating income, and consequently I can borrow less money from a debt service perspective. So you're probably not sacrificing resilience each day, but you are sacrificing what you can do. In this particular project, we sacrificed some aesthetics. So while he may have had to comply with some resilient design standard, he had to cut back on costs in other places that might have also increased the resiliency of the home, but he had to follow this specific set of guidelines because that was sort of mandated. So again, trade-offs all over. And then on the issue of resilient design, when folks were actually trying to come up with the new standards, this was from someone in the design space working for a consulting firm. He said, and in terms of the barriers developed, it was really hard. The flood hazard component is actually pretty hard to define of what flood level should be designed for. Basically, the industry is a little bit all over the place in terms of picking a base flood elevation, adding some arbitrary amount of freeboard. How do you incorporate future precipitation into that? And then later below, he goes, and then does that become too much of a requirement that people are going to dismiss it and then just look at a FEMA map and build the way that they've always built? So many, different things here. But let's move on to the enablers. One thing I will say about enablers, since we can't get to pretty much, all of them, they were almost always sociopolitical in nature. And so it always, has to do with the way that people and politics sort of come together in this space. So for one really, one enabling factor in a lot of people who are able to successfully implement some kind of risk reduction solution was collaboration and consensus building. Really having and doing the tough work of listening to everyone and coming together with a plan that everyone can agree on. And this is from, again, someone in housing finance. But the way that we came about their response was we put together a group. It was a working group of basically emergency response agencies in the state and us and insurers, and then sort of later on. But more or less, she said, and so all of those different voices came together to develop this framework, the Safer from Wildlife framework. And so again, this stuff is tough. There's so many people, there's so many things you could do, and everybody has to agree. And for the most part, this sort of long, iterative, drawn out work is what ended up actually producing a lot of the solutions that we saw. And on the same time, in the way that information can be a barrier, it can also be an enabler. This is from a real estate developer here in South Florida. She said, so I think acknowledging that South Florida has more hurricane risk than they used to and has sea level rise and all of it, that was a process to allow us to do that in order to move ahead. So it's created some great conversations, and I think it just made us think about our strategy a little bit differently, and that there are good real estate opportunities still in South Florida. So in this case, they acknowledge risk, the actual information that is available, help them kind of think about where could they, actually build a long-term strategy in the future. So I know I've been talking about this in kind of like broad ideas. I thought I'd focus on some of the actual actions and programs and things that people have done. So there are a few different ones here, and then you can kind of see what I mean by property level risk reduction and those types of things. So the city of Boston has developed a coastal flood resilience and zoning overlap district. Basically, they rezoned, but they rezoned for very specific requirements. They made a zoning change that requires that multifamily construction within a new district where 40 inches of sea level rise is expected by 2070 must implement 2 feet of freeboard above base flood elevation, and that is determined by a very specific sea level rise model that they have. Some of their, they didn't mention any barriers to implementation, but they did mention enablers of adoption. And one of them ended up being political will or leadership. They spoke very highly about their electeds who really wanted to do this, and so they did it. Another one that comes up here is right from Miami. The city of Miami's private property adaptation program. The city of Miami created a grant program in which a climate risk assessment is conducted on a property. The city matches costs of resilient improvements up to $20,000, providing up to $40,000 in investments to help owners reduce property level risks. They did mention a few different barriers. One of them, again, in the space of path dependence, not having any examples to go off of. And this isn't a quote from this person who spoke to me about this program. It was another program, but this is sort of emblematic of what I mean by that. Excuse me, of what also enabled it. The crisis, essentially that you're in crisis mode, you have a big problem, and you need to sort of do something. So again, this is not City of Miami. This is another, kind of related quote. And this person said we had 27,000 rental properties impacted by floods in 2016. So I guess the circumstance that enabled it was the broad recognition of the problem with developing in the floodplain for renters. So crisis can also be something that mobilizes along with collaboration, along with sort of political will. And then a few other different kinds of programs. Enterprise Community Partners, Resilience Academy. This is again in the space of advocacy that we mentioned. These are folks that actually provide technical assistance and some grants to developers. You sort of help them assess the risk in their portfolio, help them build and retrofit new housing as well. And then in terms of one financial solution that is sort of being floated around the industry is the idea of parametric insurance. This is a program that few different people worked on. New York City's Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, I think EDF, Swiss Re, all of these folks actually implemented and got grant funding for a parametric funding insurance, and essentially would provide up to $15,000 following a major flood event. And the idea of parametric is that an event at a certain threshold has to trigger this so that everyone is covered. The problem with this is even though it was implemented and it was funded, no event triggered the parametric insurance during that time, so we don't actually really know how it worked out. But again, one of the enablers for this pilot program was political leadership. And so this is an example of something, of folks who mentioned political leadership, what they said. It was a very hierarchical government at the time, but blank was actually a very effective administrator. The mandate went straight from the press conference to my boss, who was running the housing recovery office. And he came back by the end of the year, we're going to get every family back into a house. So again, the real power here is with your electeds. So remember that in case you ever have a complaint. So I've talked a lot about just what are the strategies, what are the barriers, what are the enablers, but something that sort of, emerged through all of the different interviews were these tensions across the sectors, things that are actually really impeding the scalability of these solutions. And because as I mentioned before, those solutions that we did, mention, they're very small scale, they're kind of ad hoc, they're responding to consumer behavior potentially, but for the most part, they're just one-off programs. So what are the big things that are actually impeding, these things from happening and taking the nationwide? So the first thing has to do with building codes. And the first thing here that many folks in sort of the design, engineering, advocacy kind of world, they said that building codes are inadequate for climate resilience. The original motivation is if you build the code, it's really good for preserving life and safety within the building process, but it doesn't do much for resilience. There's not a lot of requirements. So the basic concept here is that any building code represents the bare minimum of what builders should build to in order to actually have a house standing. But in terms of withstanding impact from risks, that's not really the main point. It's to preserve life. It's not to preserve the structure. And so when you build to that standard, then it's kind of in conflict with actually keeping people in their homes. And then when you talk to people who actually have to implement those standards from a home builder, she talked about all the different types of resilience stuff that they're implementing. This is for California, by the way. And she said that these standards, all they do is further decrease housing affordability, going all the way back to what we first talked about. She said, I can go on and on about what kind of resiliency and adaptation that we're doing for climate change, but get this, for each single family home, we're spending roughly $350,000 on top of what else they're spending just to build what I mentioned there. So it adds a lot of money, a lot of costs, at least that's what they're complaining about, to build to those standards. And at the same time, who sets the building code? Well, the building code is set by a nonprofit group. A nonprofit group develops these codes, and in order for them to be adopted, they are actually debated. And the home building industry has a lot of influence in how those building codes are adopted and where they are adopted. And so that goes to this point about the code adoption processes can be influenced. They are not just about science. So this quote says, when it comes to how the decision is made, it's like who's in the room, and it's a negotiation, which is part of the problem of having a nonprofit group comprised of different interest groups be the one that sets the model code. And so again, all of these things, again, represent just one tension about code and resilient standards and how do we build in the future. The second has to do with the role of insurance. This was actually kind of really eye-opening for me. So there is sort of an understanding that insurance can drive behavior, or insurance should drive behavior. This is from someone in the design world who said that now lenders and insurance people are asking, what's your resiliency strategy? Our clients are grateful they had something to say about it. They're like, oh, we have everything elevated, and lots of other things. And went on to say that insurance and lending is going to run with this, and pretty soon, if we're not doing something as a community, we're going to get redlined. So this is someone who feels that the insurance and the finance instruments, the financial instruments in this ecosystem will actually push people to build to more resilient standards. However, for the people who are actually trying to run these programs that encourage risk reduction, they are actually saying insurance is not doing anything about it. They may be taking away something, in terms of if you're not building to a standard, then we're not going to underwrite. But they're not actually helping to, make people more proactive. So this is from someone who is running a program that actually is introducing risk reduction measures into their new builds. From the wind perspective, we are now building houses to fortified standards, which is a wind sort of standard. We have not, however, seen a recognition of the value of that in reduced insurance rates. One thing that I think I heard was that they look at their risk on a regional scale instead of a house by house scale. And so essentially, because they do that, they're not going to say, now you've built to a more resilient standard, we're going to knock a few $100 off of your policy. Then when we spoke to insurers, they were like, well, how in the world would we possibly do that? And this is the insurance industry. They're sort of saying they actually don't have the ability to incentivize the risk reduction. They can only take away policies. So again, this is someone from that field, and he said, everything in there, the White House National Resilience Framework, is a system level answer to a system level risk until you get to the insurance sector. And then we're supposed to incentivize individuals to somehow drive system level change. They think insurers can, one home at a time, incentivize the type of behavior that could be required to significantly reduce climate exposure. I just don't think they have any idea how the insurance mechanism works. And for those of you who are not aware, insurance policies are written 12 months at a time. And so for the most part, they don't have that sort of long-term perspective. And that is what this person is saying. So again, a really big tension here because there is a lot of work in this space. There is a lot of people who are hopeful that insurance can kind of drive that change. Then there's also the tension in climate risk data. I've mentioned it before. Information asymmetry came up quite a lot. The data that is available, it is privatized data. It costs money to get access to it. So I think that's a major challenge, the data accessibility, having it not run by third-party entities, but having it instead be run by a government entity and something that is actually publicly available. And then when you actually get to another issue here with data is that for those data that do exist, what do you do and how do you think about them together? And this is for someone from government. But say there is another source of information. If it's First Street Foundation and they say that the base flood elevation is here, but FEMA says it's here, and we decided that First Street is a better estimate, then we would go with the First Street flood level. The challenge is our capacity to really say that First Street is better than the NFIP. Like we know there are limitations to the NFIP, but that doesn't mean we know what we know is it doesn't mean we know what is or isn't better. And then thinking about data as a whole, there are, as I mentioned before, really big implications on the uncertainty associated with this data. This could have very big implications on people's ability to have access to financing in the future. So on the topic of climate risk-based mortgages, something like that's got to be taken extremely seriously and carefully. There's got to be such care taken because the data that would need to accurately price these mechanisms has to be absolutely reliable and good. The potential to adversely impact people and restrict their access to financing which is where so many people have their wealth. The implications of that could be very significant. So that is, although it is something that could have a lot of impact, it is clearly something that if you got wrong, you might actually have there might be a lot of adverse impacts to people. And then again, on that issue, realigning current market distortions, this is the final tension. I know this is a lot of information. Risk disclosure and having more information as a solution comes up all the time. There are risks and you want people to have access to the information that helps everybody make a smart and informed risk. That sounds like a great idea, right? But then when you have more access to that information, and if you trust the data, for example, and you see that as a solution, which is what this person said, she said that she would ask the FHFA to ensure that climate risk is considered in underwriting of mortgages. It's a perfect example of pairing policy with capital. It gives it the stick it needs, and it's an incentive. Again, getting back to this sort of tension that you have these social and these equity and social concerns. Data can be something that drives more information in this case may not align with social goals. Sorry, I realize I'm taking a little bit too much time now, so I need to speed through this. This next figure is a bit of a work in progress. But I wanted to show it anyways because it kind of gets to the point of this work, which is to show the interactions, to actually map the details of this landscape and see where are the solutions. And so essentially here, oh wow, that's more tiny than I thought. We mapped those 7 different solution areas: advocacy, climate risk information, financial solutions, land use reforms, and property level. And you can't see it too well here, but each of these reflect one of those industries. And we're trying to essentially show the interactions and the flow of information, the flow of finance, the flow of regulation, and how it all sort of culminates in producing any single unit of housing. And the reason I show it is before this table is because we did ask people, what would be your desired policy solution? What do you think actually needs to be done in this case? And even though most of the work was centered in advocacy, in sort of structural risk reduction, most of the desired policies are actually in these sort of more impactful solutions, things that would have more far-reaching impact, like actual financial solutions. They come up again and again, sort of incentivizing the risk reduction, the thing that insurance companies said that they cannot do right now, restricting access to mortgages in high-risk areas, risk-based insurance premiums, more financing for affordable housing. And then, of course, land use and community level risk reduction, the actual rezoning, manage retreat, these bigger investments in infrastructure. These are the things that people actually want, but there's a big disconnect in what is actually happening. And that is, again, all going back to those 4 different tensions that I sort of outlined and why these things haven't really sort of taken off yet. Okay, I'll just kind of go through this a little quickly. So in terms of how can we actually get there, we asked people, do you think legal mandates and regulations is the way to go? And this was actually kind of surprising in that most people said yes. Almost 2/3 of people said that we do think that legal mandates are the way to go. I don't see how we can rely on the sort of good faith participation of private actors who are selling the product. There's always going to be somebody who provides goods for cheaper, and so you'll see markets run to the lowest level regulation. And so the only way to really ensure that we develop in proper patterns is to mandate. And this was really interesting because sometimes the same people who were complaining to me about regulations then said, yeah, I think we need them. But we need these specific regulations that do this specific sort of thing. Only a few people said that no, legal mandates are not necessary. They instead wanted to focus on some of the larger, broader market level distortions. I don't think this is the first place that I could go because there are many existing policy frictions and distortions that we could potentially address. And then there were some people who were unsure, again, really trying to tread that balance between the stick and carrot approach of providing the incentives and maybe some regulations as well. And then in terms of who do people think was actually responsible for doing all this? This is a big issue in the adaptation field because in case it's not super obvious yet, someone's going to lose. Someone's going to lose. Someone's going to be left holding the risk. And for the most part, no one wants to be left holding the risk. There's so much information. There's so much emphasis on insurance. And that's why I think for me, the insurance part of this was really, really interesting because insurance is just a way to transfer risk. No one is actually taking on the risk. So who do people think was responsible? Federal government. For the most part, most people thought, almost half of people said it falls on the government to put the laws, to put laws and regulations into place, incentive structures into place to support the best decision making. The local governments are not going to have the capacity to do this themselves. So I think it's really a federal state issue because they have the resources and the ability to do so. Time and time again, it came up that the federal government is just the biggest entity that can absorb this risk. That they can absorb this risk, they can finance. But ultimately, if they absorb it, that means we absorb it. So this, it's very interesting. It's kind of an interesting mentality. Second, the second highest responsibility fell on the local government. I would say it's the local government, the local municipal government. Could be city, could be county if it's unincorporated. that they have to they are responsible for this risk because they are taking it on. And they have to provide infrastructure for properties that may not exist in 10 years. And again, they have a very specific power here. They have the power to regulate land use. And then state government. Every state has a state insurance office. They can steer the insurability of housing in accordance with these different factors to guide people or naturally guide the market. But again, it's that balance between affordability and availability of making sure that this, there is actually a functioning insurance market. Some people said everyone, that it's a shared responsibility. My personal feeling is that the only way you're going to solve this problem, getting back to the collaborations idea, is through a joint effort. Federal, state, local municipalities and developers can't put the burden on developers because they're going to stop development. Can't put the burden on cities because they'll both go broke. And then actually, home construction and real estate development came up a lot, but for the most part, people who mentioned this is that they just don't want them to influence they don't want them to still apply the levers that they're applying to prevent resilience from happening. They want them to get out of the code adoption processes. They want them to go to the legislature and say that we do need this. We do need these innovative risk reduction measures that they say kind of run into a brick wall when contractors and developers push against them. So main takeaways. Finally, at the end, risk reduction is occurring. It is often ad hoc. It can be small scale. It's primarily composed of property level interventions or advocacy efforts. However, experts desire actions that will have greater impact, including financial solutions and land use reforms. This also includes the use of legal mandates to move faster. This also highlights the role of all governments in pushing resilience forward. There are many barriers that prevent the adoption of new policies and strategies, and most enablers are socio-political in nature. Those collaborations and that consensus building, the actual crisis, the urgency of the moment where you have to take action, and then political leadership as well. However, there are again very serious multi-sectoral tensions that impede the scalability, the implementation, and the effectiveness of these solutions moving forward. So just very briefly, a word on some of our limitations. Again, 64 professionals are not reflective of the entire nation's housing professionals that are again spread across all those different sectors. So it's not necessarily generalizable nationwide, but we think it does reflect some of the key tensions here. This is a good sort of starting place to sort of start to know where solutions can be had, what kinds of collaborations need to be formed in order to move forward. We were not successful in reaching key professionals in mortgage origination firms. If anybody has a friend, let us know, because that was just not happening. And we only got a few home construction professionals in this as well. Again, these industries, very guarded. Even in some of the I went to one conference with these folks, and it's very, very clear, the stance that they have on this issue. They are doing it because they know that there is a financial incentive to, but they're not necessarily wanting to engage in the broader ecosystem to really try to find that impact. Our study focuses on risk reduction policies for new construction. Retrofitting the existing housing stock, however, represents the greatest challenge. Most of our housing is built and it is old and it is aging. The problem is when we were trying to find people for this study, this was actually in our initial set of questions, we could not find professionals who were doing this work. This is very much a big financing issue. Who is going to finance this and how do we create economies of scale to finance this so that it's actually affordable? For the most part, that actually should be a very high priority. And finally, our study doesn't actually exist what I think should be the goal for housing, which is the integration of both the decarbonization and risk reduction measures. So we have these, these homes that are really, truly sort of resilient. And I'll just end on this note because we have put together, in all these discussions and all these interviews, we've kind of put together a vision for how we think climate resilient housing could work. This is something that was in review, but we have to go back to the drawing board because it really highlights the role of the federal government, which we expect to not have a huge role in the next 4 years. But the idea here is, again, thinking about scale, thinking about actors. What could this really look like? And for the most part, on point A, we can, this image is reflecting two futures. On this side, we have kind of our status quo, what we're sort of heading toward. And on the other side, on the right-hand side, we have what we could have if things are and incentives are aligned, if people work together at different scales, if there is information that informs really informs decisions. And again, this is just sort of our vision. So on point A, we need information. We need multi-hazard information. We need information that is really credible and reliable. And I know that actually is coming against some real scientific limitations, but at the very least, we need to understand what the information, how to use that information if there, because there will always be limitations, there will always be uncertainty. That's something that, I think the guidance for that doesn't really necessarily exist. And then getting to sort of the household level, we really do need that sort of structural property level resilience that can come in the form of building code. It might have to be something else since building code is a minimum standard. It will look different across the country. But again, really getting to, really thinking about the new units that will be built. Will they be built to last the life of a mortgage? And then sort of on the regional scale, how does land use, how do all these things, land use, infrastructure, how do they all come together to think about the community level sort of resilience? We can have that version, which is kind of what we have right now, or we can have something where we're working together. But this is something that actually is probably, I think, the most challenging. That's going to require municipalities to cooperate. And they don't necessarily have the incentive to do so or the will to do so. And then finally, on the national level, again, we have so many federal policies. We have our disaster recovery policies, our national flood insurance. We have the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who underwrite mortgages. If at some point we can align all these incentives towards resilience, what then might our country look like? And with that, I'm finished. I would like to thank my collaborators on this project, Dr. Catherine Mock and Alize Clare at University of Miami, Dr. Linda Shai at Cornell University, Dr. Radley Horton, my postdoc advisor, and some of our wonderful PhD students. I'd like to thank Dr. Bott and the department for inviting me here, and thank you. It's been a pleasure.